Donc, je me propose d'introduire, alors je ne sais pas en français ou en anglais, Ania TOPOLSKI. Je ne vois pas l'image sur l'écran, ce qui me perturbe. Ok. Donc, Ania TOPOLSKI est associate professor, c'est-à-dire elle est maître de conférence à l'université de Radboud, University à Nijmegen, aux Pays-Bas. Hein. Elle a depuis 2015. Et elle est donc professeure en philosophie politique et éthique. Elle est particulièrement spécialiste de la pensée politique de Hannah Arendt et de l'éthique de Lévinas dans la pensée juive contemporaine. Elle intervient particulièrement sur les sujets du racisme en Europe, de la question de l'identité européenne, l'antisémitisme, l'islamophobie. Et donc, elle va nous proposer une communication sur le judéo-christianisme. Voilà, je lui laisse la parole. Sorry for the French. I guess you have hear from us in English, but okay. Sorry for that.
No, I'm going to begin by saying thank you and apologizing. I do speak French. I sadly don't use French enough in an academic environment, and I didn't have time to translate this paper into French. So I'm going to apologize for presenting in English. And of course, the discussion can be in French or bilingual. If at any point I speak too quickly or I use terms that are less familiar, I would really appreciate if people would interrupt or put a message in the chat. So again, thank you for this invitation. I really appreciate the fact that there's an attempt to try to bring together scholars from different linguistic backgrounds, because my experience in Europe or in academia in general has often been that these are very separate academic spaces, which I find unfortunate, especially having heard the first two presentations from which I learned quite a bit. It's very nice to be invited to the space. So I'm going to begin with a bit of a general introduction to give a context of the work I do, and then I'll focus specifically on this signifier Judeo-Christian in a European context. Race and religion are entangled concepts. Their entanglement has deep roots in the past, which continues to strongly affect the present. It is essential to expose and investigate what I call the race-religion constellation, which complements and extends Du Bois's color line in order to understand racism today. And I specifically have an interest in those types of racism today that are often denied the name of racism. So specifically Islamophobia, and secondly, anti-Ziganism, which is anti-Roma racism. So those are my interests, but yes, my background comes more from research on anti-Semitism. Acknowledging the logic and working of the race-religion constellation also calls for a reevaluation of the view that race is biological, modern, secular, which of course is slightly different than laïque, but related, or in any way limited to phenotype. Racial logic, I argue, even prior to the term racism, operates when one group in power denies the full humanity of another group based on a particular constellation of markers of difference. Since the long 19th century, these markers of difference have been assumed to be biological or based on phenotype and have sought their legitimacy in a scientific paradigm. The race-religion constellation establishes that these markers of difference have varied much over time and space, are by no means limited to phenotype. For example, prior to the 16th century, these markers of difference were based on Christian theology that viewed non-Christians as lacking a soul, or lacking reason and rationality, or lacking civilization, among other things. While many of these markers were considered of difference, were invisible, theological laws often made them very visible. The most famous, of course, would be the law from 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, which required that Jews and Muslims wear prescribed clothing in order to be visible on the street as marked as different from Christians. So basically, it took what was invisible and made it visible. The race-religion constellation makes visible this continuity. My research begins then in the 13th century, specifically focusing on the exclusion and dehumanization of Jews, Muslims, as well as other non-Christian communities. The pattern of exclusion revealed by the race-religion constellation is, of course, not accidental. I'm also not arguing that it's intentional. So there is a space between non-accidental and intentional, and I think that's where we have to explore. It is part of a pattern or logic that researchers studying racism must grasp in order to challenge it. Why do I focus on dehumanization? This is important to say, first of all, dehumanization is a matter of degrees. It's not a question of a binary human, not human, but different degrees of othering, lessening, making inferior, which of course the opposite would be then questions of supremacy, and views of people as sub or lesser than, all the way extending to non-human. And I argue, of course, that this is manifest in different ways over a much larger historical geography period than we in Europe like to admit. I highlighted continuity in a particular logic and a practice of exclusion. When combined with institutionalized power, this is of course important, as prejudice is something I think we see as omnipresent, whereas racism is the combination, of course, of prejudice and power, or institutionalized power. This logic has the potential to exclude and eliminate difference. What differs in these periods is, of course, that there are different conceptions of what it means to be human, or a person or man, used to legitimize. So for example, today it's a scientific paradigm. At one point, it was a more religious or theological paradigm. What also, of course, offers is the language and practice of dehumanization. We often focus on questions of slavery and colonialism and genocide, but there are, of course, everyday forms of dehumanization that are very present today in Europe. So I now will focus on a specific manifestation of what I call this race-religion constellation. I find it a very problematic term, Judeo-Christianity, and of course it has different ways of expressing itself in Europe. But I'm trying to argue that it has been used to define Europe in a very specifically exclusionary manner. And it's a form of masked racism, and specifically today, a form of masked Islamophobia. So I'm first going to begin with looking at the 19th century to the same period, so the 1840s, 1850s, which the first speaker began with. And I find it, of course, not an accident that this same time and place produced these different kinds of racialized constellations. While my claim today is that the meaning of the signifier Judeo-Christian serves to exclude Muslims, in the 19th century, it was meant to exclude Jews and Catholics. It is also in the first half of the 19th century that European scholars, primarily in France and Germany, in the discipline of philology, provided Europe with the category of the Semite. The first slide then was related to Noah, and specifically the origin of the category of the Semite. So the Semite has its roots, of course, in the story of Noah and his three sons. Japheth, or Japhet, was, of course, associated with Aryanism, which included parts of Asia and European civilization. And the meaning of the word, of course, was to expand or enlarge, an association that was often used to justify the missionary activities and colonialism of the 19th century and much earlier. Shem, the second son, was the father of the Semitic people and settled in what would today be called the Middle East. And Ham, the third, who had the double curse to both slavery and blackness without salvation, was associated with Africa. And Ham, of course, means hot. And here I'm referring to scholarship by Goldenberg. At the same time, a group of German scholars, theologians wishing to challenge the newfound dominance of philology, coined the term Judeo-Christian. This group of scholars was the German Protestant Tübingen School, founded by Ferdinand Christian Bauer, who published an article in 1831. So this is the first use of this term from 1831. Bauer, who saw his theological contribution as an essential supplement to German idealism, coined this term in what can only be called a very crude Hegelian dialectic. So I'm going to put this very crude Hegelian dialectic up, but really, even if I'm not a Hegelian, I really apologize for this sort of poor interpretation of Hegel. So according to Bauer and his school, the thesis was a combination of Judaism and paganism, as well as Orientalism. Its antithesis, so this is important, was Judeo-Christianity, which of course is the signifier I'm interested in, by which he specifically means a Catholicism that has been tainted or has become impure because it has become too close to Judaism or paganism, Orientalism. So it's an impure Christianity. And its synthesis is this Pauline or Gentile or Arian Christianity, which again, the first speaker referred to. And this is therefore a Christianity that has been purified of all forms or traces of Judaism, paganism, Orientalism. Here's then a quote from Bauer. The relation of Christianity to heathenism and Judaism is defined as that between the absolute religion and the preparatory and subordinate forms of religion. We have here the progress from servitude to freedom, from flesh to the spirit. In essence, Bauer, like Hegel, has a strong supersessionist view of the relationship between paganism, Judaism, Catholicism, and Protestantism. Supersession, of course, is by no means new to Christianity, which has defended this kind of position since at least the 4th century. What was new about Bauer's supersessionism is that it's a secondary supersessionism. It is Protestant, Pauline, or Arian Christianity, which is superseding Catholicism or Judeo-Christianity, which of course here are almost synonyms. This secondary supersessionism is necessary, according to Bauer, as Catholicism is contaminated by its interactions with Judaism, as well as paganism, and he mentions here Islam, that it has become too connected to rituals, the flesh, the collective. Bauer saw Judeo-Christianity standing in the way of the spirit of Pauline Christianity. His conclusion was that in order for Pauline Christianity to guide history, it must be freed from all traces of Judeo-Christianity. His views, of course, were by no means unique to the time and were used to justify and inspire many prominent scholars, from Herder and Schlegel to Humboldt, who also fused these theological and philological categories. Much like today, religion was central to questions of politics and identity in most European nation states, including those that self-identified as secular. And I do want to emphasize a little bit more this aspect of secularity, because we sometimes forget how secular and Christian projects are very intertwined. Bauer's work and that of his many students at the Tübingen School was immensely influential beyond academia in the long 19th century and was part of what Masuzawa will describe as the transformation of European identity. So I leave this quote up. I imagine many people are familiar with the work of Masuzawa. And I continue. In the 19th century, theology and philology both sought to play a critical role in terms of the idea of white Europe. While Christendom has always been the unspoken identity of Europe, this now came to be challenged with the rise of atheism and its appeal to the sciences. Philologists did not, however, begin with the tabula rasa. They in fact borrowed the categories created by the 19th century theologians such as Bauer. The most compelling example of this, of course, is the work of Ernest Renan, which was also mentioned earlier today, who was trained as a theologian before becoming a philologist and eventually a political diplomat. In his early years as a student of theology in the 1840s, he was a strong advocate of Bauer's claims. And I'm going to put a quote up here to that effect, from Kelly. Thus, by separating Pauline Christianity from Judeo-Christianity, F.C. Bauer enabled theologically inclined linguists to associate Pauline Christianity with the Indo-European or Aryan languages, which they proved to be superior to the Semitic languages. In this vein, Bauer's secondary supersessionism of Judeo-Christianity was translated by scientists into linguistic identity markers for particular groups of people. According to Renan, only philology could provide solid evidence for the supersessionism that was originally claimed by these theologians. It is in this competition that the 19th century usage of the term Judeo-Christian, with its explicit anti-Semitism and its implicit Islamophobia, as well as its implicit anti-Catholicism, connects to what I call the race-religion constellation. Furthermore, this connection is not accidental, as is clear from the term's problematic history, which is, when further entangled by Orientalism, is defined and soon to be clearly opposed to Aryan white Christianity. And I'm going to put up another quote in the meantime, which I'm going to cut from the paper as I'm a little bit behind because of all the technical difficulties. In this manner, Bauer's Judeo-Christian versus Pauline Christianity dichotomy was interpreted and translated into what we now know as the Orient-Occident division. The Orient to Bauer represented closed nationalistic systems, whereas the Occident, Europe, and especially Greek, is the origin of freedom. This interpretation and translation occurred during the colonial scramble for Africa, at the same time as anti-Semitism is on the rise, so the mid to late 19th century. The timing, of course, is something we need to think further about. And of course, it also helps to construct both an external and an internal enemy in order to create a much stronger identity for European nation states, which, as Hannah Arendt has shown, were struggling at this time. What was taken from Bauer, amongst other scholars, was his highly influential theological Protestant history of ideas, a strong notion of progress, and of course, this idea that history was being hindered or was made an obstacle by Judaism as well as other influences. In a nutshell, these influences were used to prove that Europe could return to its rightful place at the center of the world as the most civilized, if only it were to refine its connection to Pauline Christianity and free itself of the chains of Judeo-Christianity. This is a story we can best see actually looking at Germany, and specifically at different universities in Germany. So one of Bauer's students was Albrecht Ritschl, who saw Protestantism as the cement that could bind the different classes in Germany, which of course was necessary for the project of nation building in Germany. The new state, established in 1871, the same year the term anti-Semitism coined, has a distinctly Protestant identity, and with Otto von Bismarck being hailed as the national hero of political Protestantism. So here I want to take a few moments to go into the brilliant scholarship of Susannah Heschel, and then I will skip a bit to the contemporary space. Susannah Heschel refers to this process that I've been describing as racializing Christianity, which she argued culminates in the Third Reich. And I think it's important to say that its origins are much earlier to the Third Reich, just as it continues much more into the present than we like to admit. So it's really not something of a short history, but has a whole prehistory before the Third Reich, but this is when we see its full color scheme, let's say. And specifically in institutions such as, and she focuses on the Institute for the Study and Eradication of Jewish Influence on German Church Life, founded on May 4th, 1939, the same day that in 1521, Luther completes his translation of the New Testament into vernacular. And it's quite explicit. They chose to found this institution on that date to make a link back to the early roots of the Protestant Reformation and its freeing itself of the chains of Catholicism. Again, in the founding speech of this institute, they quote Bauer and also continue to quote the importance of freeing Pauline Christianity from Judeo-Christianity, freeing the spirit from the flesh, freeing the Aryan from the Semite, so that link is made, and freeing whiteness from all forms of color. So here you have the explicit link of the philological, the biological, and the color line. This lecture was given by Grundmann, who specifically says that the goal is the supersession of Protestantism, which was to be the guiding ideology for the Third Reich. And a quote here by Heschel, and I will then move on. It was not difficult to racialize Christianity, according to Heschel, because of these strong affinities between theology and racism. While even today, many scholars and individuals find it difficult to separate racism from its biological manifestations, it is clear that biology was just one expression of Nazi racism. And in fact, the roots of Nazi racism were much more spiritual. This is another quote of Heschel's, which argues that point, to really try to get away from this idea that Nazi racism was biological primarily, and that, in fact, it was much more religious and cultural than we like to admit. The foundation for the racialization of theology was set in the 19th century when scholars were focused on discovering the real Jesus. This is something, again, mentioned earlier today. The Tübingen School, amongst others, played an essential part in this. For them, Pauline Christianity was, despite its origins in the East, a Western religion, and as such they set out, and I quote, to define the essence of Christianity by purging of it anything that smacks of Judaism or of the Orient, legalism and particularism. Modern scientific theology was an attack on the Orient, which was seen as spiritually and racially incapable of freedom because of its dependence on law, the rituals, and the flesh. For example, of course, circumcision. Judeo-Christianity, or Jewish Christianity in its Latin form, holds Catholicism hostage, as it's not free from this Semitism. The struggle between this Arian Protestantism, which today is clearly associated with whiteness, and this Semitized Catholicism rehashes many polemical tropes of the 15th century religious wars. In addition, its hairs, which includes Europe today, are not limited to the realm of theology. Academic disciplines intersected and cross-fertilized. It is thus not difficult to appreciate how Bauer's logic landed on very fertile ground and served the Nazis' racism with its root in the late 19th century, and sadly continues today, coming full circle in its construction of the enemy, the Muslim. So let me then skip to the present and just checking in. I have about 10 more minutes, is that right?
10 more.
Okay, I definitely find that. Yeah, I just need to get my PowerPoint. It's not going to work. Oh, yes, it is. All right, we'll try that. So moving to today. Oh, sorry, okay, that should have been from before. While Europe and the European Union have several founding myths, a significant public debate about Europe's identity took place between the 2003 and 2005 in the discussion of the preamble to the proposed EU constitution, which we of course know eventually failed. After a prolonged and controversial debate, the EU Parliament voted not to include a reference to Europe's Judeo-Christian heritage. Nonetheless, the question of religion emerged in discussions about the Constitution's preamble that sets out to define the shared values of the Union. Furthermore, a connection between religion, identity, and political communities was explicit in the various national media headlines related to the intense parliamentary debates and public discourse on this draft constitution, which tied the question of religion directly to that of European identity, also to that of racial inclusion and exclusion. As the EU debate makes clear, politicians, the media, and religious groups sought to include the term Judeo-Christian as central to European identity. For one reason, of course, was to atone for the Shoah and acknowledge the symbolic role and history of Jews in Europe. They, of course, were unaware, or at least failed to recognize, the complex theological and racialized history of the term Judeo-Christian. The reason, of course, for this mistake is that there was a turn to the US, where this term has a very different history, which of course comes up during World War II, and the entire prehistory of what happens in Europe is being forgotten. An example of somebody who does this explicitly was Prodi, who was of course at the time the president of the EU, who identifies Europe's Judeo-Christian roots as complementary to Europe's secular humanist heritage. So he makes the link between these two, both of which he argues are the foundation of Europe's political family. And he really stresses this idea of family. And I think it's important to note that he was asked and he didn't answer the question of, what do you mean by family? And can other people join the family? And I think it's worth noting also that this discussion is happening at the time where very much France is excluding Turkey from inclusion in the EU, or even the discussion of the possible accession of Turkey to the EU. So there's a link happening between what's happening politically and these debates and the question of can Turkey or Islam be in any way part of Europe's family? The meaning of the signifier Judeo-Christianity thus shifted from originally excluding Jews and Catholics, as we saw in the 19th century, to now specifically or symbolically including both Jews and Catholics in order to fortify its exclusion of Muslims. What the current usage of the signifier Judeo-Christianity brings to light is how functional it has been in creating an exclusionary identity for Europe. And in this vein, it is a hidden manifestation of one of these particular race-religion constellations. It reaffirms the categories, hierarchy, and power of Europe as Christian, with Christianity being reshaped to prioritize a secular or a spiritualized Pauline Christianity. Semitism is taken to contaminate and pollute Christianity because of its attachment to collective rituals, publicity in the flesh. This, of course, we see very clearly in what kind of Christianity is publicly allowed to be manifest and which kinds of Christianity or non-Christian religions have to stay private or hidden and not visible. Pure white, privatized, dogma-based Protestant Christianity is, of course, privileged. This is also happening in the States with the idea of WASP, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The signifier Judeo-Christian in a European context is one among many political discourses today that serves as a facade for unifying identity driven by exclusion, which at present focuses on Muslims. The phrase Judeo-Christian explicitly seems to include Jews, but of course the ghost of Jews, as Jews are no longer present in Europe after 1945, or at least not in the numbers they were prior to the genocide. And of course also to include Catholics, although legally we see the priority still goes to forms of Protestant Christianity. The use of this term, of course, has been analyzed further by others, and we see that in different European contexts, it does have slightly different stories. But in all cases, it seems to be a way to symbolically include Jews, move past the Shoah, not focus on any form of true atonement. It also seems to sort of promote a form of Judaism that is free from rituals. So a Judaism that itself has become rather secular or laïque, and promote a very privatized form of Christianity, one that does not have collective public ritualistic manifestations, which of course is precisely what both Islam and Judaism do or tend to have more of. So there's quite a clear sort of priority for certain forms of religion in European public spaces. So let me see, I'm going to skip a bit there, I think. Yes, I can come a bit now. Let me see if I can get, oh no, I can't get. All right, so just to wrap up, conclusion, in the above, I have analyzed Judeo-Christianity, which is a seemingly inclusive or very benign signifier, in order to demonstrate its past roots and European genealogy, which is explicitly exclusionary of Jews, pagans, Orientals, Muslims, and Catholics, and then to show how the same term comes back a century later, after having been exported to the States, a part that I skipped over, and brought back to now become part of Europe's history and Europe's heritage, and here now to include symbolically an empty ghost-like presence of Jews as well as Catholics in order to fortify itself specifically against Muslims. It also shows how even today, in our supposedly secular times, how entangled race and religion remain in Europe, although of course these manifestations are very much hidden. Not only do we need to explicitly challenge such exclusionary discourses, we must also be willing to speak of racism in Europe today and its roots in the category of religion. As such, my normative plea is to make visible all forms of masking of race and religion in Europe as a first step for a much longer struggle for racial justice and inclusion. This, I would argue, would be the true meaning of the post-Shoah maxim, never again. Thank you.